Hi, Bother Brigade. Here's what's bothering me today. Far too many of UK content creators that you see and find online are white, and that's going to change today. And we're going to do something a little differently today. So, with me today is my guest, Jay. So, Jay, tell us who you are, what you do.
Hello, yes. So I am Jay and I am on YouTube, Hyphenated History. I'm on Twitter, Hyphenated J. I basically make videos about UK social history from a Black perspective, in terms of how imperialism plays a part in our day-to-day lives, and how it's shaped our histories, the sort of continuous relationship that we've had with the British, because there is this narrative that exists that all of this is recent and all of this
Mm,
is new and all of this is born from like the mid 20th century onwards. And so my channel is basically a very long-winded way of me saying, no, actually, this has been going on for ages. And actually, quite a lot of it has been happening under our noses. It's just been happening in ways that we are not educated about. And a lot of the education that is out there is not easily found. So my channel is not the be all and end all, but it
of
is
course.
trying to sort of bring some of these things into a place that makes it relatable to people's day-to-day lives. Because the way history is taught in the UK is actually kind of very hands-off, not particularly relatable, doesn't particularly bring it home to us.
It,
So
it,
yeah.
yeah, so I guess we can sort of start with that point. Is one of my great problems here in Canada is that our history books read like a timeline of events. This happened, and they just ask you to remember a few key bullet points, but not analyze, certain rebellious instances or wars or mistreatment. It's just things happened, which brings us to today, and you will be quizzed on how well you retain this knowledge. There's no analysis of it unless you're lucky and get a really good teacher. Is it the same in the UK in that regard?
Very much so.
Oh,
And
that's depressing.
the syllabus has barely changed. So I'm exposing myself for being kind of old. Like I was in secondary school 20 years ago, and like even then the syllabus is barely any different. Like there are certain subjects because the education system is always in a state of flux, constant state of flux. They're always changing things quite significantly over here. But I think that makes an even more damning case for the way history is being taught. Because so
Mm-hmm.
my mum was born here. She's a late 50s baby. And so that would have been when the British Empire was still very much alive and well. She is older than the independence of Nigeria. And my dad was older than the independence of Jamaica. And the education that they would have received in the early bits of their primary school, maybe perhaps not my dad because he came here when he was 10, but my mother um, would have been about the empire. And it would have been post-war as well, because the war would have been still pretty recent. And then the usual kings and queens stuff. Once the empire was over and that wasn't something that was socially acceptable to teach about anymore, they just kind of removed it entirely, because it was really an education of glorification. It wasn't an actual education on how the empire behaved, how the empire manifested itself. So instead, you just got the Tudors and the World War, and we didn't learn anything about what they were doing in India. We didn't learn anything about how Australia and New Zealand and Canada and all these other places ended up part of the empire. We didn't learn anything about that. And the only reason why I believe we even learned about slavery in my specific school is because my secondary school was like 70% black and quite a few of the teachers were black. And because it was a Catholic school, we also learned about the Irish famine, and that's something that I didn't realize was not routinely taught until I started talking to people who did not attend Catholic school. And it's like, yeah,
Wow.
you're not gonna attend a Catholic school and not hear about the Irish famine because the Irish teachers will make sure you learn.
Right.
And then I think that it was like, okay, and let's make sure the black kids learn. But even about slavery, but even then, it was from an abolition perspective. It wasn't from the perspective of how abolition had come to pass, how they ended up enslavers in the first place. It was just very much William Wilberforce, Oluwada Equiano. We were lucky to learn about him because most people don't learn about him. But it was like almost it was framed as if it was a reaction to what was going on kind of in the States. And so they made much about American slavery and how they didn't abolish it until afterwards and how they were coming and intercepting the ships and aren't we great?
Yeah,
And
it's. Ugh.
yeah, It's still like that. It really, there are campaigns, it's still very much unchanged. And then when you get to GCSE level, you learn more about World War II. And the UK is still very, very preoccupied with both world wars, but particularly the Second World War, because that's the one, depending on how old you are, there are going to be some old people who remember it. So
Right.
therefore, it's still very much in the public consciousness. And I think it's a safe bet because that's the one bit of history that feels communal. You know, there are lots of people, great grandparents who fought in the war or what have you. And so they won't stop talking. And I don't think they should stop talking about it, but it's an incredibly limited curriculum that we have here.
Oh, it's the same here. I mean, I haven't really gotten much of an update except for my younger sisters who are going through school. So I quiz them on this, like, hey, what are you girls learning right now about, specifically because some of them are in Quebec, so specific Quebec history, but also what are you learning about Canadian history, world history? What are you learning about social sciences, racism? Like, tell me, and they're still kind of cagey, like, I don't know, it's this, and so that's not encouraging to me. But I think another point about World War II is that it's one of the very few wars in which, Britain and America are objectively the good guys, which is why so many people in said countries love making films about it. It's like, oh, Churchill and like his speeches and, stiff upper lip, keep calm and carry on. And America like, yeah, but we went and literally liberated the world. Yeah, America. And it's like, so y'all got this one thing, like one time that y'all
Mm.
were on the right side, but that deserves so much more expansion. And so yeah, I think it is time that we kind of start delving a little bit into the British Empire, and like you point out about how it's just, oh, the British Empire was a thing, not evaluating how it became a thing, and crucially its centuries of slavery. Britain loves to talk about how it ended the slave trade. Not that it ended slavery as an international system, of course, but that it ended the slave trade. And, oh, even here in Canada, we're all super proud that we abolished slavery decades before America. And it's like,
Yeah.
hey, so how come for everything else here in Canada, our history seems to only start after Confederation, July 1st, 1867? How come that's, oh, that this is our history, but anything before that is, well, no, that's the British history. So how come we're taking credit for, abolishing slavery when that was still a thing where we were very much proud, loyal British subjects first and foremost? And hey, guys, when did the Brits take over Quebec? Oh, the 1730s and 1760s? Oh, hey, does that mean that slavery was still around at that point in time? Oh, wait, no, now we're getting analytical. Can't have that in the classroom, right? It's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. Also, to the Irish famine, that is kind of shocking, but sadly not surprising that it's not taught in schools, which you would think people would be at least aware given how Ireland's right next door and there's a ton of, like, I don't want to say cross-pollination, but like exchange of people living and working either in Ireland or Northern Ireland or in the UK and vice versa. Like, there's clearly a lot of exchange going on there, so you would think that it'd be more culturally known. Not saying that it'd be easier to talk about, it'd still be this kind of gross, disgusting stain on history, but you would think that it'd be more well known. That's sadly shocking and depressing.
No, it's a huge bone of contention because it is very conspicuous, and it's one of those things. Even in my school, as much as they tried, I didn't find out until much later that it wasn't just simply a result of a blight hitting the potatoes. It was like, well, there was a reason why they only had potatoes to eat. We didn't know that. We didn't know that the British were stealing their food. So they didn't even teach us that. And that changes everything about it, really. It's like, okay, fair enough. You can kind of be told a story about a population at the time when we were young. We didn't even question it. Or why is this group of people only eating one crop? It didn't occur to us to ask. And then when you look back, it's kind of obvious that the rest of their food was being restricted from them, being given the fact that it was more or less a plantation society at that point as well. They were producing so much. That was all their economy was geared around, was producing for the British.
Classic capitalism.
100%. And so it's a huge bone of contention between the Irish and the British, because the British, as far as they're concerned, as you've said, there is that cultural exchange, there is that long-term relationship, and so they kind of tend to see it as, I guess, like, oh, we're friends, you know, and yeah, we might have been a bit mean to you once back in the day, but you're free now, guys. You're free. You're one of the most successful countries in the EU. This is great. And whereas the Irish are like, guys, that was like the best part of a millennium. Um, and also the latter centuries of that. In fact, the entire time was full of genocide and oppression. We used to speak our own language, and now by and large we don't. And that was relatively recent that you know, so it's kind of
Yep.
like it's not the dynamics are not equal at all. And also the British still, it's a weird thing that the British have going, in the sense that the English specifically, where you've got these English landed gentry who still own parts of Ireland, because while Ireland sort of politically became independent from the British, the private parts of Ireland's holdings weren't made independent. There was no mandate there. So you have, for example, the Irish palace, not palace, but you know, where their parliament is held, the land on which that sits is still, there's a covenant with an aristocrat, with a member of the English landed gentry, and that is where their
Wow.
government is held. So there are, and this is going to be the case everywhere where the British were. I think probably the only place possibly where this isn't the case, and I would even be hesitant to say that, is the States. That's probably the only place that doesn't have any old English covenants associated with it anymore. Um,
So you're not far off. But I've there's this brings to a neat little tidbit of Canadian history that people don't fully understand. Is that there are two parts to why Canada doesn't have an official aristocracy with like sirs, or like, you know, knighted lords and ladies and dukes and baronesses and things like that. There are still a few that were inherited from like the New France days, which is still again really weird. So like you're not far off, right? Like there's a few here in Canada, but some just have not even like been passed down. It's a weird thing, but we had the rebellions of 1837, which fought against an actual aristocratic class that was against democracy and the flourishing of democracy in these nascent settler colonies. And it took open rebellion for the Brits to finally come over and say, "What's up with all our white settler colonies engaging in open revolt? Clearly, something's going on." And while the rebellions were ultimately failures, and that we didn't completely separate from Britain, it did result in a process towards some reforms. And they were kind of, the Brits themselves were kind of shocked that the ruling class of the colonies of Upper Canada and Lower Canada just really wanted to be aristocrats and like lords and ladies and not have any democracy whatsoever. It's like, guys, you have democracy here in the UK, so what's going on? That's kind of silly. So that was the first thing that kind of stopped that from happening. That's why there isn't, say, a Duke of Toronto, for instance. But the second thing that happened was actually after World War II, where our then Prime Minister, Sir William Lyon Mackenzie King, changed Canadian citizenship to be more of an actual official thing, which meant that no one else could then be knighted over in the UK. And that's why he or like someone else was like the last person to be knighted in Canada. And that's why, like, when you look at all our early leaders and prime ministers, it's like Sir So-and-so, or like the Earl of Athlone, who came over from Britain to be the Governor General here in Canada for a few years, and then they went off to like somewhere else in the Empire to be the Governor General, and then back. It's like, can we talk about this for a hot second? People, like why this is kind of going on and how it's sort of real and not real and only stopped like after World War II officially. Like that's really weird that not a lot of people realize. And that, you know, Britain sent its rich aristocrats and royal family members to go and serve the interests of the crown in every corner of the British Empire. Ireland, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, Uganda, Kenya, Nigeria, like everywhere.
yep, yep. And it's funny because what you were saying about, not to go off topic too far, but that fact about Canadian citizenship is one of my favorite facts because it the knock-on effect that that had on the creation of the British Nationality Act 1948, and
It's
then
around the same
that
time, yep.
that then caused, because that's not widely understood what actually triggered the creation of that act, and then what that act ended up doing in changing the landscape of the British population, because that's where we got the Windrush generation from. And
Yeah, we should talk about
so
this.
because so the way it's framed to us is that post-war, this place was on its knees, there was a labor shortage, and so they invited loads of people from across the empire to come and work. This is true, but it misses the fact that the British, whenever they do anything, it's always from a forced hand. So you had all of these different dominions who were trying to assert themselves to some degree. Canada got the furthest by actually creating its own legislation and creating the concept of Canadian citizenship, which was new, to the British, who at that point had always, first of all, there wasn't really a concept of citizenship, it was subjecthood. And secondly, even though the dominions were autonomous to a degree, they weren't really. They were just preferred out of the empire. It was like, okay, yes, you are the white-led settler colonies. Of course, we're going to give you priority.
Yeah.
But then it gave the British Empire a bit of an identity and authority crisis that to have, because Australia was hot on their heels too. They were about to do basically the same thing that the Canadians did. And so the British Nationality Act in turn was created almost as like a higher authority from an imperial perspective. So, okay, sure, Canada could get citizens from anywhere in the world, but that was specifically Canada's business. Those citizens would not be able to then leave and go anywhere else in the empire and be able to be considered a citizen of those places. It's still ultimately the British who determine who is a citizen of the empire. And so the other thing that I find really interesting is that their intent behind that was they wanted white settlers to come and help support the British. They did not picture people from the Caribbean, people from Africa, people from the Indian subcontinent. They did not picture that, but
Yeah.
that's what ended up happening. So it's the narrative is always they cut that bit out in the middle and they just say, so there was a need for post-war labor. So then they called upon their colonies and said, come home to mother country. And they came. And it's like, yeah, but also no, they weren't picturing those people.
Yeah.
And
It's like, wait a minute, why are the boats full of brown people? I expected white people.
But literally, like, that's what was happening because the prime minister was not happy. There were various very high profile politicians at the time who were not happy and were like, I don't understand, what are we going to do? We need to find a way of stopping these people from coming. And then they just had to go with it, basically. But then they did everything they could over the next 20 years to undermine that until they finally were able to curtail the flow pretty much entirely. So it's just very interesting about that period because, as I said, of the way it gets reported and even the way that story gets told is very reactive because it wasn't widely understood until the so-called Windrush Scandal. Where I don't know if you've heard about it, but basically
I have, but it should be explained for people who've never heard of it before.
So the Windrush Scandal, I don't like calling it the Windrush generation because of the Windrush Scandal. It's basically so the Windrush generation, for people who are not familiar, is a name given to the people who migrated from 1948 through to about 1970-ish from the Caribbean. It's named after a ship that landed in Liverpool in 1948. And basically, the reason why it's called that is because in the early 2010s, she wasn't Prime Minister at the time, she was Home Secretary, Theresa May, implemented something called the hostile environment, which was an anti-immigration policy. And it was named after literally the sort of the lab name given to the term given to when you are creating a situation for bacteria to be unable to thrive. So it was literally already dehumanizing.
Wow.
Yes, the hostile environment is not a media term. It's literally taken from the papers from the Home Office. And so it's fairly self-explanatory. It was designed to make conditions for people they considered undocumented as miserable as possible. So it took away their ability to hold a bank account. There were many bank accounts that were shut. There were people getting evicted from their social housing. There were people who could not work, but also could not claim any benefits. There were people who could not access healthcare anymore without paying out of pocket. Um, I haven't even gone into all of the things. It basically every form of liberty you could think of was being impacted. And the people who were impacted the worst were people who were children. So they had come from the Caribbean on their parents' passports at a time when they were still considered British subjects. And the idea was that their citizenship should have just transferred automatically once they were no longer considered British subjects via the empire because their countries had become independent during that time, right? And while lots of people were able to officially sort out their passports before it even came to that, by passport I mean everyone would have been a passport holder, but what I mean is that all the back end paperwork. Some people hadn't, right? Some people were simply passport holders, and where it was like, okay, this was just a straightforward transition, and suddenly there were all of these standards that had been put in place in terms of how to prove citizenship if you've been born overseas. And suddenly you had a group of people who'd been living here since they were very young children, having to now find a whole load of proof for normal things, because now going to the doctor required you, if you put that you were born somewhere else, you needed to prove that you had citizenship in a very specific way. And so it just became a downward spiral from there for a lot of actually quite old people at this point. Like the youngest would have been in their 50s. And people died waiting for their cases to be heard. The government did officially recognize this as a failing of theirs. And so one of the things that they did was they created Windrush Day. And now all of the rhetoric around it is branded as Windrush, which is why I personally don't. I use it because it's so commonly understood. It's too late now. But because I know where it came from, it was like, okay, here's this very tokenistic gesture. We're going to give you Windrush Day, which is kind of like very similar energy to corporate Black History Month. It's just one day where you get to talk about, oh yeah, my grandma came here and worked in the NHS as a nurse, and now here's some jerk chicken. It's giving that kind of energy, and you can apply for funding to do nice little days to celebrate. But it is a paper over the cracks of a scandal that has not been resolved.
And justice hasn't been served to the victims of it.
None. Like there are very few people who. So there's a compensation scheme that from the get-go was not fit for purpose. There is this ridiculously low percentage of people who have received any payment, and the payment is usually insulting. And at this point, it's very obvious that they're just waiting for people to die, because they're not going to do anything. Every Home Secretary that's come in has undermined it more and more. I think the compensation scheme was brought in. It was either Sajid Javid or Priti Patel. I know Priti Patel presided over most of it, but it may have been introduced.
My God, what a monstrous woman she is. I mean, oh my God.
Well, she's been replaced by someone who's even. They keep getting worse.
I know, but it's just like, oh God. But like, some of the stuff I remember her saying and doing was like, are you actually soulless? Like, I'm genuinely asking that question of Priti Patel. Oh my God. Sorry, I just had to, because like, my God.
No, don't worry. But yeah, so it's been continually undermined, and now we've got Suella Braverman, who has more or less said she's not trying to. There's a few pledges. There were a few promises that there was an inquiry into their performance, and so it was like, okay, you need to do better. These are the things you need to do, and she has gone on record to basically say that she's not going to fulfill them. So at this point, and this is all within about 10 years from when it kicked off to now. But even then, because the other thing that I don't like about the way the Windrush scandal is framed is it makes it seem contained. It makes it seem like it was just this thing that happened under Theresa May onwards. But actually, there's been a long running practice of deporting people from the Caribbean very quietly, that is basically the same as the Windrush. It's just not directly related to a specific generation of people. It's more related to a specific region of people. So there was a period of time from like the 1990s onwards where a lot of people were just being deported. And it was just it was just something that was on the periphery of your aware, not periphery, but it was like everyone's family had been affected by it in some way. Either someone was under threat of being deported or was actually being deported. Um, and the narrative around that is nowhere near as strong as the Windrush. And I think that if we understood that more, we would understand that the Windrush was a continuation of something that had been going on this whole time, and that it is an even bigger scandal than what we understand it to be.
Right.
Because a lot of the time, deportees are incredibly vulnerable when they go, because they don't know the countries they're going to, and they can't come back to the UK to sort things out, and they become slim pickings for things like crime and abandonment. So it's you've got organizations set up in the Caribbean specifically to help deportees from places like the UK. So it's yeah, it's I can't even
It's
remember how I
horrifying.
watched that, but it's horrifying. And so it's just been more, one piece of state violence after another. Um and so for me, the narrative around the Windrush being a paperer over cracks is what irritates me the most. Where it's like, okay, we put in this scheme, yes, we made a mistake, but we started to try and do something about it. It's like, you didn't. But you've given us this nice name, I guess, which is one boat that brought over some people. It wasn't even all the boats.
Yeah.
So,
No.
yeah.
Yeah, and like with regards to the Windrush generation, one of my favorite tidbits about Canadian history, and plays into the compare and contrast. In the late 1800s, there started to be some musings, especially given America's actions in the Caribbean and Central America, that, hey, maybe Canada, in the interests of the British Empire, of course, should consider taking over the control or management of the British colonies in the Caribbean, possibly even integrating them into the Dominion of Canada. And one of my favorite tidbits from this time is that some of the colonial leaders in the Bahamas had expressed an interest of this. And some in Canada thought, oh, you know what, that's a good idea because the Bahamas are right next to America. We see how America is constantly involving itself with Cuba, with Haiti, and with the Dominican Republic. They could go for that next, and that's going to be kind of a problem for the empire, right? And so some people thought, oh, hey, maybe we could bring in the Bahamas as a new Canadian province. And it faced incredible pushback up here in Canada because we can't possibly allow for a majority black province to exist. Yeah. Yeah.
So the in the way of imperialism.
Yeah, just like, hey guys, I know imperialism is important, but in this case racism is more important than the imperialism. We'd have a majority black province, and I don't know how my white brain could possibly handle that. And one of our most celebrated prime ministers, who appears on our $5 bill, and he's famous for being like, oh, look, the first French Canadian prime minister, born and raised in like a liberal and, led unprecedented growth and industrialization of Canada. What a great guy. He is on record as saying that he was very much against black and brown immigration to Canada, especially black immigration from the Caribbean, because, whoa, and this is like early 20th century, by the way, right? But his whole thing was, whoa, no, we can't have this because, see, black people just couldn't possibly handle our very strong, awful, cold Canadian winters. It's not that I'm racist, it's that the weather's the problem. These are actual things that happen to actively try and discourage either like the incorporation, even in the name of imperialism, of black imperial subjects, their fellow like British imperial subjects into, another facet of the empire. It's like, whoa, no, we can't possibly have this. And like, I only found out about that when we were doing a school report about this guy, and we accidentally found it out in like a newspaper that just like from the time and like the National Archives. we just found a newspaper just kind of casually saying, oh yes, the prime minister has a good point when he points out that black people just aren't suited for the cold weather. And me and like my Somali partner and like the two other white kids we were working with were just like, what? So yeah, this is Canadian history, and like not exactly same period of time, but exact same kind of procedural institutional racism and bigotry. It is unreal.
Yeah, very much so. And it's like, this is why the Commonwealth narrative is very interesting to me as well, because it's like, there's never anything been common about that wealth, but also it was always about the dominions. It was always about the white settler states. It was not about the rest of the empire. There was always this hierarchy. So you mentioning the British turning to the Canadians and saying, hi, do you like trying to delegate some of their imperialism to them does not surprise me.
Like it was amusing. Nothing
like,
ever
wow.
became like official, but they were like, "Hey, Canada, what do you think about possibly doing this?" And like various business leaders were like, "Oh, hey, Canada's a new thing. We should join Canada from like we want the independent colony of Barbados to join Canada as a territory because we white people could like extract even more wealth and whatnot." Like it was like backroom dealings. It wasn't an official policy, though. I should stress that about that. Sorry, I should have been more clear about that earlier.
No, but I mean, even the attempt to like start it, I mean, it's like, it just doesn't surprise me that they approach them for that purpose, which is why it doesn't surprise me that the Canadas and the Australias, etc., have gone on to be imperialists themselves in their respective regions and internationally. It doesn't surprise me at all.
And yeah, I think you're right about a spectrum of awareness. People kind of assume that New Zealand and Canada are kind of just quiet corners of the world where nothing bad or interesting happens. It's like, yeah, okay, settled by the British, but like, look, like, see, they're literally at opposite ends of the world. They're next to like larger, more obnoxious countries. Oh, look, that's poor for them. Meanwhile, it's like, so kids, after Canada was formed as an official colony, and our prime minister wanted to secure basically half the continent for the white people. The deal that brought British Columbia, the westernmost colony, into Canada was a promise of a transnational railroad. That transnational railroad was built mostly by Chinese laborers, many of whom were still not granted permission to live and remain in Canada, and were actively discouraged from bringing over more Chinese people through the form of head taxes, and just like outright bans and pogroms against Chinese Canadians. Additionally, all that land goes through indigenous land. So to try and get from, say, the habitable part of Ontario, which is the nice agricultural south around several of the Great Lakes, through like the dense forest and rocky hills and mountains of northern Ontario, and then through the vast prairie, people don't realize that to connect those 2 points, Canada effectively colonized itself from that point. We brought in, of course, white people from various other corners of existing Canada or from Europe, and some from America, but it was mostly about trying to get people from Europe. And this is why in the prairies you have massive German and Ukrainian and Polish populations, which is why the pierogi is basically an unofficial Canadian food. 10% of Canadians have some form of Slavic ancestry. This is why a lot of it is concentrated on the prairies, because we got farmers from like Poland and Western Ukraine and like the northeastern parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire to settle in these areas to become good white citizens of settler colonialism. That's what it was. And like, we celebrate this as some great national achievement and vision of, getting to the West Coast. It's really weird and unsettling when you think about it for more than a minute.
Very much so. Very much so. It's oh my God.
Yeah, history is horrifying.
It is, but it must be known. I very obviously believe this. But yeah, it's the myths that countries tell about themselves as well, I think is really quite fascinating, because there's that weird interplay between wanting to come across as mighty and unfuckwithable, but then also benign, and where it's like, if we did do anything, it's always for a reason. It's but usually we don't bother anybody. And I think Canada might be one of the places that's like excellent at this, because obviously,
yeah.
I don't think any European country Some, yeah, I think. Oh God, yeah, no. Scandinavia, Scandinavia, I would say is similar
Really great
in
at hiding their horrors. Yeah.
very, and even down to the indigenous suppression and things like. Yeah, it's. Yeah, maybe Scandinavia is a parallel because I was thinking even the Britons and the Frances of this world, um, as much as they try to hide behind the states, it's not really possible. Like people, I don't find that people know that as much about the French Empire as the British Empire. More so, I think it's just a language thing
Yeah.
than anything else because very people who speak French know about the French Empire.
Yeah,
Um,
ask the Haitians how they feel about the French
yes,
Empire.
exactly. Exactly. So it's like, they're not too unknown, but people don't know enough about the Dutch. People don't know enough about the Spanish or the Portuguese because the Spanish and the Portuguese are currently quite poor. And so imperialism didn't pay off for them in the long run in some ways, but in other ways, particularly Spain still has overseas territories. It still has possessions in what you would consider if they're not autonomous islands, then they should be African if anything else, but they belong to Spain. Um, and then you've got like Central and Eastern Europe, which is a little bit controversial because they were part of the Eastern Bloc. And obviously, Slavs have their own situation going on historically. But it's interesting that you mentioned the sort of Slavic presence in Canada because I find that those kinds of white people always exist in like this weird space where it's like once they leave Europe, especially once they leave their part of Europe and go pretty much anywhere else, they do very much buy into whatever white structure pre-exists. So it's like, yeah, okay, you had this going on in the Russian Empire, or you had this going on during the Soviet era, but globally speaking, you are very aware of your appearance and your Europeanness. Um, so it's yeah, but on an international scale, I think it's kind of difficult to say what Eastern Europe is doing to say somewhere in Africa. Although I know that Zelensky um, is doing a very interesting thing in constantly trying to address the African Union to get them to commit to some kind of support. Um, to the point where I'm getting
Okay.
worried. Like, it's like, can you leave them alone? They've said no about 20 times. So,
But yeah, to actually get on back on topic a bit, part of why I wanted to talk to you here was to also talk about some of our experiences growing up through this stuff. So we have talked a bit about Windrush and Canada actively discouraging black immigration in its past and even arguably in its present, right? Like there's polls showing that a vast majority of Canadians, like 80% of Canadians, are more than happy to accept unlimited Ukrainian refugees. If that means adopting the entire population of Ukraine, which would be like double our own population, well, that's just fine. No problems there at all. Meanwhile, it's a fight to get 10,000 Afghans who helped our imperial presence in Afghanistan out of Afghanistan. It's a fight to get rid of people who helped us. There was all this pushback to trying to bring in Syrian refugees after the Civil War got started in like 2011 and 2012. And there was always like these awful excuses, right? Of like, and we only wanted to bring in like 24 or 25,000 Syrians. And so, that's how ISIS could sneak into the country. And there's, the RCMP and CSIS, our version of the CIA, saying, no, like they're actually very much not a threat and you can control that in these humanitarian camps. They're not going to send fighters to a humanitarian camp for months when they could be fighting in Syria. That's not really a thing. Well, we just don't have the resources. Canada has private sponsorship of refugees. It's one of the few very good things about this country, where if you have the means and the organization, you can privately sponsor people to immigrate to this country. And so people said, no, like we absolutely have the room and the resources. Various communities were showing their support for this. And then it's like, oh no, there's always got to be some reason. And there I am thinking, like, dude, just say what you want to say. You don't want more brown people in your country because you're afraid of white erasure, because you feel this is your land, even though it's indigenous land who you are incredibly racist to. And it's all just projection because you're afraid that one day you're gonna be the minority, and you know how minorities are treated, and that fucking scares you. That's really what it all boils down to, with so much like anti-immigrant rhetoric, at least here. But I don't know much about the UK. I just know like the recent just completely against any and all human rights bill that Suella Braverman has brought in. So yeah, maybe want to inform people about that and how it's like over in the UK. Now that I've just kind of said how we are in Canada, still to this modern day, very much racist in our immigration policies.
Well, there's even another Canadian connection as well.
Oh my God, so many connections. It's almost like we're part of the same empire and it's the same structure.
Yeah, as you were saying, right? So these are all thematically linked, yeah. So the illegal immigrants bill is basically making it so that there is no legal way of becoming an asylum seeker when you actually look at the process of elimination, because it's saying basically if you show up via a boat, or if you show up, there's going to be no way that we're going to legally consider you as an asylum seeker. So, and then what that means is you will not be entitled to recourse via our modern slavery laws. That's one of the biggest concerns, because a lot of people are trafficked here. And so one of the ways to sort of bring justice to those people, especially if, you know, we every I want to say every year there is something that is pretty high profile, but there's going to be tons that are not particularly high profile, where you have a group of people who are being smuggled in and they end up dying one way or another, and you can prosecute whoever it was that was bringing those people in. And basically what it's saying now is if you are a so-called illegal, aka if you are a person who has not come via the more formal means of immigration, because they've basically said, well, we almost don't believe in the concept of being an asylum seeker anymore, because they've closed off so many different ways of being considered an asylum seeker.
Which is,
you have to just deal. And that includes children, that includes everybody. Also, on the subject of children, before they were deporting families left, right, and center, but there's this specific category that you can be, which is unaccompanied asylum seeking child, or unaccompanied asylum seeking minor, right? And even that is very dehumanizing, the process of assessment that those children have to go to, where if they're not very obviously, like say, like a prepubescent child, basically they go through like age assessments, which have a lot of them are based at their core on like phrenology and stuff. Like they'll try and figure out how far your bones have finished growing, and there's so many problems with these age assessments, because it's very hard to biologically determine how old somebody is down to an exact number. You're trying to tell whether this person is under the age of 18 or over the age of 18, but 18 is an arbitrary number, right? It doesn't tell you that much about what your body is doing. So but these children, either way, can also be deported under this legislation. And previously, local authorities, so social services here, had a responsibility to accommodate these children while they were going through their age assessment and while they were going through the story of how they got here. So it's the lead up to this has also been very dehumanizing, which is why the Gary Linekers and various people have been calling this out, including a lot of Holocaust survivors and the children of Holocaust survivors, who have said this is literally a lot of the common rhetoric around this resembles what was going on in the lead up to the implementation of extermination camps and pogroms in violent pogroms prior to that. So why I said that there's a bit of a Canadian connection there is because this is all linked to a rise in anti-immigrant sentiment that I would say there's many chapters to it, but one in particular, the specifically Islamophobic chapter, would have been post 9/11. And one of the most sort of controversial stories of our time at the moment is there's this young girl called Shamima Begum who
Yes, I know the
um
story. Yeah.
yeah, so she is South Asian. She's of Bangladeshi descent via her parents. She was born and raised in the UK. At the age of 16, she left to join ISIS. This is the story that we received. She eventually found herself in Syria, and the story is disgusting. It's very, very harrowing what happened to her in the sense that so much had happened to her at the hands of adults, at the hands of adult men. And then it recently came out that the person who recruited her and two other of her friends, two other teenage girls, was a Canadian spy. So the whole thing manufactured. It wasn't even organic, and
Oh my God.
it was a Canadian. It was an adult man who groomed and recruited these three girls, of which Shamima was one. And so that's why I said there's a Canadian connection there. So,
Good God.
and as I said, what has happened to her is harrowing because she's about, I want to say she's about 23-ish now, 24-ish.
Yeah, she's an adult now, and also doesn't she have a kid?
She no, well, so she gave birth to three
Okay.
children, none of whom survived, and this was all but
Okay.
by the age of 19. So this is why I was saying what happened to her was unbelievable because she was married off to some grown Dutch man. I think he was well into his 20s. And that's what they do to the young girls who go over there. One of the first things that happens is that they get married off to somebody. So that's what happened to her. And even with that, the Dutch don't want to take responsibility for her. I know that she was there for a little while through a technicality of being married to him. I don't know if she's still there because the Dutch government didn't recognize their marriage. So I don't know if she's still being receiving refuge there, but she's not allowed in the UK, even though the Bangladeshi government have said we don't have to take responsibility for her because the argument was that she was eligible for citizenship, which describes so many of us, including me. Like if you have parents who are from a particular country, a lot of their constitutions will say they do jus sanguinis, aka you have the lineage of this country, therefore you can have citizenship, but you have to still apply for it. You don't just become automatically a citizen. So the fact that she had never applied for it made her solely a British citizen in the same way many of us are. And the Bangladeshi government made a point after everything that had happened of saying, well, we're not going to have her. And I don't necessarily blame them. I feel kind of neutral on that either way. It's like, I don't know how, because everything about her is a British creation. She became radicalized in the UK.
Yeah,
She
she
lived
spent
in
most of her life in the UK.
actually, and the circumstances that led her to have those beliefs were distinctly Western and distinctly British. She would not have felt like that in Bangladesh. So it's kind of like I get why they didn't take her, even though there's a part of me that thinks that I wish they had, but I guess I understand why they didn't, because really she shouldn't be accepted by anywhere because she's British. She should be accepted back here. So yeah, the illegal immigrants bill is massively influenced by things like that because nobody really went out to bat for Shamima Begum. Nobody went out to bat for any of these people who were reported in the news as having been radicalized, and they were out to get us anyway. So oh well. And yet,
Yeah, it's like, well, you know what? That's your fault to go with ISIS. You should have known better. And it's like, I understand to an extent where that sentiment comes from. But at the same time, it's like she's a teenage girl who's going through who knows what and being groomed and radicalized people. That should be taken into consideration. But I remember, lots of people were saying, no, she should be stripped of her citizenship. Let her rot. And it's like, again, there's a part of me that understands that given the brutality of the ISIS regime. But at the same time, I don't know, call me a bleeding heart liberal, even though I'm not a liberal at all. But, there should be care and compassion for young people who sometimes can make incredibly awful mistakes, especially if they've been groomed to do said things by not having proper supports and structures in place in their lives, and they're being taken advantage of by people who themselves should know better. There's a part of me that wants to be empathetic and understanding of that,
And also, systemically, everything was leading up to this because she comes from a part of London that is very, so it's got a large Bangladeshi population, therefore a large Muslim population. And so we've got this thing called the Prevent Strategy, which is a counter-terrorism branch of
Oh, I
government
see where this is going. Okay.
that was designed specifically in the wake of 9/11 and 7/7. There were terrorist bombings on the 7th of July 2005, I want to say. And so in response to that, the Prevent Strategy was implemented, but it was designed to specifically target Muslim communities. And so on top of that, Tower Hamlets local government has been in a state of crisis because there has been somewhat of a hostile environment, not an immigration hostile environment, more so like the political environment for local Bangladeshi politicians has been really rough. So there was like a whole scandal, like there was an expensive scandal, and the mayor of Tower Hamlets was ousted, and now he's back. And the Muslim community are just constantly targeted by the establishment. And so the safeguarding measures that are supposed to be in place for children and young people are not fit for purpose. Like if you read the report for the local authority, they get completely slated basically for the failings in terms of like protecting children from radicalization. And there are lots of parents in the area who have been appealing to authority saying, I am concerned about my child. So when you start sort of adding all of that up, there are community leaders, there are imams, there are all these different people who have been saying, we are worried about our youth. It's not that it's not a case of people sitting back and not caring. They're trying to be proactive. And so I'm not saying that Shamima Begum's parents did this, but I'm saying that they could have easily have done. And if they did, they wouldn't have got anywhere. So the idea of not having compassion for her, when in my opinion, she was literally created by these circumstances. She would not have been like that had it not been, not just for, post 9/11 on a sort of high level perspective, but there are these very specific things that relate to her and her story, even down to the part of the country that she's from.
Mm.
That need to be taken into consideration. And then the final bow to wrap everything up was the Canadian spy radicalizing her, because you could have almost had the argument of, okay, well, she had a degree of autonomy even with those circumstances. But then you've got someone right there who is manipulating the situation, and this is a child. Then it's like, well, actually, how much autonomy did she have in this choice? How much of a mistake was it? This was a manufacturing.
Yeah.
So, and yet here we are. She lost her appeal recently, so she's gonna continue reappealing. I don't know where this is gonna end up, but I think the other thing is that she is a figurehead of all of this. I think that this goes a lot deeper. I think this is a lot bigger. I think this has happened to far more people. I always think that whenever I see stuff like that, and I try and dig around and find stuff. But yeah, the illegal immigrants bill is a convergence of all of that and then some, basically. And so it's just funny that yeah, my mind kind of went off slightly talking specifically about Shamima Begum, but yeah, it's like
it's relevant to the whole discussion though. So yeah.
Yeah.
And to actually bring it back to something you were saying at the start of this sort of subsegment about the bill and how the UK is just trying to criminalize asylum seeking. We're having a similar thing here in Canada that no one's aware of, and it's something I've been actually wanting to make a video about for a while, but I've just been so busy with a million other IRL things, including now like some charity and like local community organization work. So I'm like, oh, even less time for all the videos I want to do. Nice. But no one is actually illegal. The UN itself says that there's no real illegal way to claim asylum. Like it's about asylum itself. It doesn't really matter how you do it. And that brings us to something that was recently in the Canadian news for a bit, which is Roxham Road. It's an unmanned, unofficial road in upstate New York, right near the Quebec border, not too far away from Montreal. And what happens is people predominantly in America suddenly started showing up in the Trump days. They started showing up and just walking across the road, going to like the nearest place and claiming asylum because they were told that this was probably the best way to do it. Now, again, as I maintain, there really isn't a right way or a wrong way to claim asylum. It's just about claiming asylum. But it became a thing, and then more people noticed that more and more of them were coming up. And so then it became this kind of unofficial border crossing. So it's, there's cops there with the cars and big tents for processing and testing. It's basically an unofficial, official border crossing at this point. And recently, it became a huge political thing because the leader of the Conservative Party, and unfortunately, more than likely, our next Prime Minister of Canada, was saying, this is awful. The Prime Minister needs to get a grip on illegal immigration. And the Prime Minister and others somewhat kind of rightly said, if we close this down, there's such a massive border, a new one would just kind of spring up. So kind of like, But it also kind of spurred into the national consciousness because the government of Quebec said that, oh, look, there's too many people crossing at Roxham Road, so we just can't possibly pay for the services for all these people. What's never mentioned in Canadian media cycles is that at least around more or less 80% of all people who claim asylum through Roxham Road have their appeal for asylum denied, and then they are sent back to the States, or in some cases, back to their home country. Because what happened is with many of these people, they got a visa for the United States, a temporary foreign worker visa, and then that expired, and they were afraid of what was going to happen, and so they decided to try their luck in Canada, fearing persecution, because, like, Trump was saying some pretty heinous rhetoric, right? So that's kind of understandable of, oh, okay. And so they're also talking about, the safe third country agreement with America and why that might need to be changed. It's kind of a whole mess. But for me, what's so infuriating about this whole story is people are acting like, crisis of illegal immigrants on our southern border at Roxham Road. And it's like, guys, the vast majority of people there don't actually manage to succeed in their asylum claims because the government says, well, you had a visa for America, which means you could just stay in America or reapply for another visa in America. So there's no need, bye. That's the vast majority of the stories. So when Quebec is saying we're being overwhelmed by the thousands of people crossing at Roxham Road, it's bullshit because most of those thousands are sent right back. When the government is saying, oh, well, why bother doing anything? It's like, maybe we should actually fix things because America's a nightmare. Not saying we're good either. We're very much a nightmare too, but America is like a sleep paralysis demon nightmare, whereas ours is a nightmare that's kind of just like drug induced, perhaps. And so, like, and then you have the conservative guys saying, yeah, this is a problem. We need to deal with illegals and, look at this guy making life so much harder for you. And again, it's like, guys, most of these people aren't even allowed to stay. And many others, this is another scandal that keeps breaking year after year, where we will bring in hundreds, if not thousands of people to various different small farming communities. They live in absolute squalor. Hey, thank you for picking our fields. And then they send them back to Mexico, Guatemala, Cuba, Honduras, etc. And it's like, hey, thanks for making money for the state at dirt wages and helping feed Canadians and allow us to sell food overseas at a markup so that we can pretend to be good and generous. Please go back home and maybe come back again for another growing season where you can share what's supposed to be a 4-bedroom house or apartment with 50 people. It's basically all mattresses in some of these places. Some cops who have gone and like broken up some of the when they get a tip off of like, oh, hey, there's like a real humanitarian crisis. Some cops have to go to therapy and have been shown to have a traumatic response to what they saw. Some of these conditions are so horrific that it gave cops, people who brutalize and kill Indigenous and Black people, it gave them PTSD. That's how bad the situation is here for migrant workers that people don't know about. And instead it's, oh no, we can't spend the money on social programs because a couple thousand people crossing Roxham Road who then promptly get sent back. And that's not part of the story. Like, it's such white bullshit.
No, yeah. Wow. I mean, there was a lot that you were saying that was similar in terms of taking one aspect of a story and making it out to be some kind of invasion. Oh, we're being overrun.
A big invasion, yeah.
And then it's like, well, first of all, it's such a small number of people, and second of all, you don't accept most of them because it's the same with the UK. The UK is, I think, the country that accepts either the second least or the least number of refugees in the whole of Europe. And the rest of Europe have been getting onto the UK to various degrees over it. What you were saying about Turkey is something that yeah, it's known. Well, I say it's known. It depends on what you read. But the way the UK frames it, it's well, the reason why your referral is taking 18 months on the NHS instead of 2 is because of all these immigrants. They're in the way, or the reason why you can't get a house is because of the immigrants. The reason why you can't do, and funnily enough, what you were saying about um people working on in agriculture, in the food supply. So there are so many things going on with the British food supply at the moment, but right now what we're dealing with is shortages and everything is very expensive.
I actually
Now,
made a few videos about this issue like a year ago. Yeah, like it's
well,
a mess there.
yeah, yeah, it is. And so, but one of the things that what I find really interesting is that, so we have a similar dynamic of having so-called migrant workers coming and doing our picking. And some of those people were from countries like Romania, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, poorer parts of the EU or EU adjacent countries. And so many things have been happening, including Brexit itself, that makes it harder. But then also, quite a few of these countries' economies are improving. So, like Poland, for example, which at one point I think there was the best part of 1 million Poles in the UK from all ends of the class spectrum. So you had some that were like, middle class graduates doing certain things, just, maybe well established. And then you had working class Poles who came, even if they were degree educated or what have you, they were put in these low skill, low wage, not no, low skill, low wage jobs, right? And it was almost like a trope to have like Eastern Europeans working in these fields and stuff like that and doing these jobs. But their economy is doing great. So there are hardly any Polish people coming to work here, number one, because it's been made harder, but also quite a few left.
Yeah.
So quite a few people have left and have resettled themselves back home. And so what I find fascinating is, I mean, there was a lot of illegal labor on those fields too, and us leaving the EU is not going to stop that illegal labor from still happening. So there are still people who are probably working in these fields. But now the problem is that because the UK produces so much that it sells abroad, we don't necessarily eat everything that we make. We sell it, and because we've left the EU, so it's not a case of a lack of labor. Like I said, they were already using modern day slave labor. It's they can't sell it to the Dutch anymore. They can't sell it to the French anymore because it's just so much more complicated. So some of the food has been allowed to rot. Some of it wasn't produced in the first place. We're also having a hard time importing food for the same reasons that we were having exporting. So it's just
Yeah,
and then
like pictures of bare shelves
everything
in Britain. It's like, what?
everything is happening. The Brexit crisis is happening, the labor shortage is happening, and the inability to sell the stuff, meaning they didn't bother producing it in the first place, is happening. And what it's adding up to is food that was cheap before is now super expensive to the point of it being rationed out, or you can only buy some of this at a time per shop. Um,
Jeez.
but it is a problem of the Brits' own doing. It really is. This is not because of actual shortages. This is not because of, oh, there was some disease that hit this crop and now no. Like it's literally a combination of all of these different factors.
Yeah, it's about a bunch of policy decisions that were made, which kind
Yeah,
of ties in a little bit to what you were saying earlier about the Irish famine and how it wasn't just, oh, what an unfortunate event. It's like policy failure led to that. Like it did to the Bengal famine in Indian and Bangladeshi history. Like famines are more often a product of policy failure rather than crop failure or weather.
Yeah, very much so. So, and there were lots of parallels in what you were saying about the conditions that migrant workers are living in, because it's very similar here. There was literally yesterday, there was a fire in East London in a flat where there were about 40 people living in this one tiny flat. And
Good
they were
Lord.
all workers of one description or another. And this was in the middle of like inner London, you know. Um, there are horrific modern day slavery and trafficking cases in non-urban parts of the UK as well, particularly the bits that are adjacent to like agricultural land and stuff that you don't hear about. I don't even think that story about the fire in London is going to make the news. I only found out about it because of who I follow. So there's all these different things that happen. And yeah, what you were describing just reminded me of that.
Yeah, and unfortunately, there's a lot of commonality between how the West operates. Like, I know we're mostly trying to compare and contrast Britain and Canada, but really, like similar things happen in the States with Germany, with Spain, Italy. Like, it's a Western phenomenon. It's not strictly just for the former British Empire. It's just, I don't know. I guess ultimately part of what annoys me the most about Britain and Canada and the imperial legacy of these countries and the other dominions, like the white settler dominions, is how it all just feels like they'll smile at you while stabbing you in the back. It's just kind of like, no, see, we're nice, we're proper, we're good. Oh yeah, we made a bit of an oopsie, but come on. Or like, I don't know, it's hard to really fully articulate, but there's just something about it and how the propaganda has been so effective for people overseas, like especially for Canada. Like when I'm traveling overseas, people are like, oh, Canada, oh, there's like, oh, you must like hockey, eh? And it's like, I mean, but nah. Why are you speaking like an American? Because most of us actually speak like this. Your idea of a Canadian accent is very specifically regional. It's like thinking everyone in Britain speaks with a Cockney accent, or everyone in America speaks like, someone from rural Appalachian Pennsylvania, right? Like there's different accents. It's not all one thing, but people think of Britain, they think of, London, and it's all cosmopolitan and, tea parties and lovely accents. They don't think of like chavs puking at 5 a.m. on the tube, right? Like that's not part of the British experience for people's mental ideas. They don't know how virulently racist people in urban or rural settings can be in the UK. Same here in Canada, right? So it's just kind of one of those things that I find always just rubs me the wrong way when we try and like sanitize our imperialism and racism and couch it in inclusive language. Like, for example, the whole multiculturalism thing here in Canada. And hey, sure, there are plenty of people who honestly believe in that and want that to be a thing. But there's also many of us who, hey, while that's something great to aspire to, recognize that there's a lot of problems with that and the understanding of it, and why like it's just kind of a bunch of hokum here, because the government doesn't really work towards that in terms of our immigration policies, addressing racism, misinformation online, actually encouraging people to settle beyond like the 4 big Canadian cities that immigrants tend to settle to, right? So, and it's not to say that immigrants aren't elsewhere and in smaller Canadian cities. They absolutely are. But it's definitely a problem when, the government is talking about multiculturalism but not really doing the work. It's just like, yeah, multiculturalism and peacekeeping. And it's like, we haven't done any of this meaningfully since the 90s. This is like 3 decades now of inaction. So what's going on, right? I don't know what the UK's policy is on there. But I know that Canada, especially Quebec, has definitely inherited the European idea of ethno-nationalism. So it's like, sure, there are British citizens, but they're not English, Welsh, Scottish. So it's like, you don't really belong here, right? And so in Canada, it's sort of a bit different because we recognize like, oh, we're all immigrants, and then everyone tries to downplay that we're on stolen indigenous land, and there are still significant indigenous populations and communities here. We kind of try and ignore that, but Quebec, it's like, yes, Quebec, our land, and sure, you may be a citizen of Quebec who speaks French and immigrated from Haiti or Guadeloupe or from Algeria or from Morocco, but you'll never be Quebecois. And I'm like, oh my fucking God, here we go, right? Like, it's a very much a problem here, and yet I don't see any work by the supposed multicultural Canadian government state infrastructure to meaningfully address and push back against these kind of notions. So I don't know what the situation is in the UK and how people view things. I did see you nodding your head very vigorously at one point. So please, yes, go off.
Well, I mean, where do I even start? There's like two things. Let me actually start with the thing that I'm probably going to forget, because there's one thing I'm definitely not going to forget. So, on first of all, on the note of multiculturalism and the way it's described and applied, I might make a video about it. Basically, that's kind of where I was at, because I have a lot of thoughts, but it will be somewhere down the line if I do. Because if I speak to a specific example of how the UK, so yeah, you spoke on the different countries within the UK and how those identities kind of manifest, right? And so I'm English from London. So in some ways I am like, or we are kind of like, I wouldn't say cut off, but depending on what you bother looking up and reading about, you may not necessarily be fully au fait with the little details of Welsh or Scottish or Irish nationality and the way it plays out. And from this angle, as an English person, for example, very few of us actually call ourselves English, because it's probably, I would say, out of all four, the most exclusive identity, right? And so you do have some Black people who want to push to be called being English. It's not really a top priority of ours. Like, there were a lot of people who wanted to be called British. That has now kind of been achieved. You do have Black British categories, etc. Englishness is very exclusive. But the way Welshness and the way Scottishness and the way Irishness are sold, particularly because of the dynamics that they have with the English, where there's always like this, we are a bit more forward thinking than you because we are being oppressed by you. Therefore, we have a different view to you. We're not going to be like you. You're exclusive. You're oppressive. We're not going to be like you. Scotland can get in the bin with that because we can talk about its own imperialist history and all the rest of it.
Part of the UK and the British Empire, yeah.
So it's kind of like, I'll put them over there for now. But the people that I actually want to talk about here is Wales. Because Wales slips under a lot of radars in how racist it is. And in the UK, you have Plaid Cymru, I know I'm mispronouncing that, which is the Welsh nationalist party, right? And it's not nationalist in the same way that like Britain First is nationalist or Vox is nationalist or something like that in Spain. But it is nationalist in the sense that it is trying to get self-determination, right? And so the Welsh language has been massively pushed because of the aftermath of the Welsh Not policies of the Victorian era that, eradicated the language among the majority of the people in the space of like less than a century, etc., etc. So it's a very sore spot in the Welsh identity. And then there's been a whole load of things that have happened. I was literally just watching something the other day that reminded me of this, of Liverpool. So the city of Liverpool is on the west coast of northwest England. And so it's not too far, it's right next to Wales, basically, right? It's north of Wales. And so they flooded, or the English flooded a whole village of Wales for something to do with Liverpool, right? To expand something in Liverpool. It must have been one of their ports or whatever. And so there's all this stuff that had been done to Wales on the back of England that people don't know about, people don't learn about. You don't learn about Welsh history in mainstream British education. You don't. So, but because of that, because of the sort of narrative it's created around itself of being oppressed, which is true, and the reclamation efforts of the Welsh language, it's like it's treated as this distinct category from multiculturalism. So it's like, we are multicultural Wales, and they might wheel out a brown person, wheel out a Black person, and it's like, we are all Welsh, and they're speaking English. But then the multilingual nature of Wales is only about Welsh language. They don't celebrate the different languages that immigrants speak in Wales. Wales has been a multilingual place for years, for ages. But the only multilingualism that you celebrate is Welsh language. And then even when you are putting that Welsh language foot forward, it's very much a white Welsh foot forward. So there isn't any effort to integrate either on that level of, okay, let's have all of these different colors of people speaking Welsh, or let's just celebrate all the different languages, including Welsh. And it's very underhanded, and it's very kind of again, it's something that you wouldn't be aware of unless you were actively going out of your way to keep up with Welsh politics, but it's something that Welsh people of color have been going on about for ages, to mostly deaf ears. And so I just think it's very interesting, the way country nationalism in this country. I would be so interested to see in a let's say tomorrow, if Wales, Scotland, maybe not Northern Ireland so much, because it's a different situation, but if Wales and Scotland became independent, I wonder what would happen to their nationalism, given that particularly with Wales, I know it's an issue in Scotland too, but that's a whole nother category in and of itself. But I wonder what would happen to the nationalism in these countries, because at the moment it doesn't feel racist, but I know that there are elements of it that are racist. So that was the first thing of just that kind of point that you made about that aspect of multiculturalism. I wanted to get that out of the way because I know I'm going to forget. But the thing that I was also nodding very vigorously about was the way multiculturalism in particularly urban centres is portrayed. London, Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, all of these places, Birmingham, very racist places to live in, right? And it's something that even we internalize about ourselves. That I live in London. London has more than half of the UK, the entire UK, never mind England's black population living in it, right? There are about 2.5 million of us. Over 1 million of them live in London. And so it's very possible to end up in a bubble. What I said earlier about my secondary school was 70% black. That does happen, where you might live in an area, it might be a specific corner of your borough in London, but there might still be a corner of it. And these places are being heavily gentrified, by the way. So there's that, which I'll get to. But the way these cities make out like they actively nurtured that is completely false. We just landed here and then stayed. It wasn't that you encouraged us to be here and made it easy for us to be here. We just ended up staying because safety in numbers, which is also why we are overwhelmingly concentrated to cities. Yeah, you find us in rural parts and towns, but we are overwhelmingly concentrated to the Londons and the Birminghams and the Manchesters. And so why I say all of this is because it's particularly egregious in cities where if you do have a racism problem, because the city has kind of sold itself. I remember there was this paper that I was reading ages ago, this whole piece of research, and it was talking about Manchester and talking about London, but it was focusing on Manchester in particular, and where it was saying that like its local authority, if you go there, the posters, the literature, the website is going to be like, yeah, these are our communities. This is how we see ourselves. We celebrate our multiculturalism. And what it doesn't talk about is the history of how it got there, or how London got there, and how there were lots of right-wing groups who were aided and abetted by local politicians. You've got Birmingham, which I think can't fully get away with not talking about its racism, because it was a BNP heartland at one point, British National Party heartland at one point. And I don't know if you've ever seen this very famous picture of Malcolm X in the UK. It was one of the last pictures he ever took, because it was a few days before he was killed. And he was in a place called Smethwick, which is in the West Midlands. It's within the sort of Birmingham administrative area. And there was the BNP headquarters was based there. And there was a very famous conservative campaign of, if you want an N-word for your neighbor, vote Labour, right? And so Smethwick has that whole kind of historical narrative around it. But then at the same time, it will always punctuate it with, and now we have the largest Sikh temple in Europe. So everything's fine now. And I think Smethwick might be one rare exception of a place that just cannot get away with telling that beginning and end. Because I think they would be more than happy to just tell you about the big Sikh temple and not about, well, 50, 60 years ago, this is what was happening. But for the other urban areas, including the rest of Birmingham, including London, including Liverpool, they just put their multicultural foot forward first. And I think that one of the upshots of this, which is what I want to make a video on, is how ethnic minorities have internalized this. So you do kind of walk around thinking, yeah, racism is not a problem. It's only in the rural areas where all the white people are that the problems happen. But then you know in your own personal life that you have experienced racism in your own area. The only difference is you may have had a load of black people witness it, but you're still experiencing it. And then there is the infrastructural racism that you experience in these cities too. They are very segregated. The wealthier parts tend to be white. The poorer parts tend to be ethnic minorities. The white working class tend to be treated as their own specific entity that everybody needs to rally around, even though no one's actually doing anything for them. They're just more of a rhetorical device. So you've got all of this going on, and the white working class looking at you and feeling resentful because you took over their city. And I feel like a lot of ethnic minority guards are very down, especially I would say from maybe midway through Gen X down age-wise,
Okay.
because that completely coincided with being a young child and having this multicultural policy now that the local politicians have decided, okay, we can't beat it, we may as well join it, we may as well use it to sell ourselves and market ourselves,
It's all
and
about
also
money.
yes, very much. And also, we embed it into the school system in these areas. So we tell the children, yes, this is a lovely, diverse place and we like having you here. And then the children internalize that and say, yes, you do. And they don't necessarily always have their guard up for racism because they've been told since they were very small that it's not a thing in their area. And it has created a weird issue. I truly, like, as I said, it's still kind of cooking in the back of my mind, but I do want to make a video about this because there are some issues, in my opinion, about the way Black people of a certain age approach the topic of racism, because we have it so embedded in our minds that it's a thing of the past, very much on the back of, I would say probably from like the 70s, but definitely from the 80s onwards, of how we were taught and how, and it's not just school, it's media, it's adults around us even say, you know, it's all fed in. But I don't think the UK is multicultural. I think it just happens to have a lot of cultures living in it. I think there is a difference there.
Yeah.
I don't think we're nurtured. I don't think we're encouraged to maintain these cultures beyond what can be commodified. So does that a multicultural country make? You know, it's like we can see it so clearly with the United States, where it tells itself that it's multicultural, but it's heavily assimilationist. Then it's basically like, just as long as you say American first, then and even then there's a sliding scale of acceptability there. And you can see it clearly. It calls itself a melting pot, but we know it's very racist. But I think that applies to basically anywhere that refers to itself as a melting pot. It's almost like a red flag phrase at this point.
Yeah.
You know, are you really?
Yeah.
No.
I forget if like it's something you've talked about like apartheid and how like those. Yeah. Okay. I made a video a while ago now. I can't even remember about how some Quebecers view themselves, because there was an election recently and there's this scandal that blew up, and I decided to make a video sort of explaining part of the scandal and why it's all a bunch of BS in terms of what the main separatist guy was trying to push for and advocate. Is there's a somewhat popular book in certain Quebec circles called Les Nègres Blancs d'Amérique, which is just the white N-words of America.
I've heard of this book.
Yeah,
Yes.
because members of the FLQ, who were a terrorist organization that tried to achieve through violence the independence of Quebec, some of them fled to America and found safety and shelter with the Black Panthers. And so the author kind of tries to explain about how, you know, this shows cross-racial solidarity. Like, in many ways, it's actually a fascinating book, whether you read it in French or English or another language. It is worth a read. Not saying I agree with it, which I'm about to kind of explain, which I sort of summarize in the video, but, you know, there is an example of that, you know, struggle for liberation and showing solidarity across class and racial and linguistic lines. This is all very good. The problem is that it also shows how a lot of, like, Quebecers who are by nature of this white ethno-nationalistic view themselves, which is very similar to how South Afrikaners, or just like Afrikaners, view themselves as, we wanted to be the white imperial hegemon of this area, but now we have to play second fiddle to a different white hegemon. That makes us victims of oppression too. And it's like, yeah, there have been a lot of awful instances of how Quebecers and just French Canadians in general were treated and disenfranchised by the British Empire here in Canada. But at the same time, it's like, guys, you had a literal textbook when you were New France called Le Code Noir, which was a textbook on how to do slavery. It was a point of pride if you could be the kind of Quebec slave owner who could afford to import black slaves from the Caribbean. Look at me, I'm so wealthy I can have the black slaves, because the vast majority of slavery in Canada was indigenous. And the average age was like 16, and most tended to die by their 20s because they had to go on further and further slave raids where they had not been exposed to European diseases, so they would be brought back, exposed to disease, and died, thus necessitating further slave raids and the trade with other indigenous nations for slaves that they would bring from their far-off corners. And so it's like, oh, okay, so we're just not gonna talk about, again, the slavery of black and indigenous people in this country. I'm supposed to feel sorry that this was supplanted and then Quebecers played second fiddle. And I say this as someone with like Quebecois heritage on my mom's side, like the white side of my family, you know, and like, yeah, these were awful things that happened where we were actively trying to discourage anything from like Catholic immigration to just Catholic existence, preventing French and trying to bar it in various corners of the country, deliberately sidelining them as the English project was expanded throughout Western Canada. Again, Canada colonized itself. So, you know, like, yeah, there are definite instances of the suppression of French and Quebecois voices in this country. But to try and equate that with the struggle and the actual slavery and oppression of black and indigenous people is just so absurd to me. And yet here they are saying like, you know, well, we're oppressed too. It's like, guys, come on. Like, really. And like, I see and hear that with Afrikaners too, of like, the British had us in concentration camps. And I'm like, yeah, my guy, you also cut off people's hands if they didn't work hard enough in the emerald mines. Like, this, like, there's a part of me that says oppression is not a game, right? Like, there shouldn't be layers of oppression and victimization, because as a core concept, it is wrong. But at the same time, you know, some context is crucial here. You know, it's like, hey, yeah, not saying the British didn't treat Afrikaners poorly, but y'all were still seen as white and thus given immense power and privilege over the majority of the black inhabitants of South Africa. Like, it's just wild to me.
This is my moment to plug a channel that I really, really love. Let me just, because I'm just getting the name up now. So it's Third World Miss Explores.
Yes!
She's done videos on this. So there's literally one here, Afrikaner Minority Rights, South Africa Political History.
Yeah, the Helen Bosch thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, I'd plug that because honestly, like, it goes over everything that you've just described and more. Like, it's the way she breaks down the kind of the way they develop their persecution complex and how it plays out today, and the fact that they are so diversity and inclusion in South Africa has to bear the white minority in mind, which gave my mind a bit of
it's a weird thing to think about, right?
Yeah. It was like wait.
Yeah, it's like, wait, white people actually the minority? We have to consider minority rights through this lens? Interesting.
My brain did switch off for a second and switch back on. Like, what? But it's on the technicality. It's, I guess, true. They are a minority, and this is why language matters, I guess, and definitions matter for things. But
and context, crucially, yeah.
But they were the ones in charge, so they were the ones who were able to define it from the very beginning. They had a head start on this shit, but it's just like unbelievable. So I love her channel. Everybody should watch her stuff. But
go subscribe right now, everybody.
Everybody, go and subscribe and watch all of her videos now. But yeah, and yeah, the parallels there with the Quebecois, for sure. And the wickedest thing is, because I was thinking about this earlier, that I don't know that much about Canada, but I know that the Quebec region has some serious issues with racism. Like, this is one of the few things that it's like, if I were to go to Canada, would I go? Maybe I would go to Montreal. Would I go to anywhere else? I don't know. So that might be an ignorant sort of foreigner perspective, but it's like one of the few things that I know that Canada hasn't been able to hide about itself.
No,
basically.
you're not even really that wrong. I'd say definitely go to Montreal. It's a great city. Honestly, so far still my favorite Canadian city. It's the most interesting, still very diverse, but in a different way from Toronto. Has a lot more history and historic architecture, and just like it's more interesting to be around places and neighborhoods than in many parts of Toronto. And Quebec City, at least in the old city, is beautiful. All that, like, I know it's, it also reeks of colonialism, but it is kind of like being in Europe on the cheap as a Canadian. You could just go to Quebec and it's like, old stone architecture from the 16 and 1700s, and they speak a language I don't understand, and there's good food and so many pretty things to take photos of. It's just like Europe. I'm like, yeah, okay, so those two, go have fun, have visits, but again, speaking to someone who has lived and worked in Quebec at different points in his life, same with my dad. He's worked in different parts of Quebec, mostly on the other side of Ottawa, which is called Hull. That's like part of the neighborhood of the city of Gatineau across from the nation's capital. And he lived there for a while, like back when I was a kid. So I'm familiar with part of that as well. And yeah, there's still a lot of racism. And again, even in Montreal, but the two largest cities of Quebec are still worth a visit, just to say, yeah, you went, you had some fun. But again, dice roll, and if you're going to get some angry Quebecois man or woman ranting about how immigrants are ruining my nation, it's like, you're on indigenous land, shut up. Like,
Exactly. It's like your ancestors are Acadian, like, and French. Like,
well, no,
guys,
Acadian is a separate thing. It's ethnic and race politics are very much a weird thing here in Canada. It deserves its own. Actually, it deserves its own channel. I'd love to see someone actually kind of delve into it, because it's a weird thing, especially in what's considered like traditional or historic Canada, which is like Southern Ontario, Southern Quebec, the Maritimes, and Newfoundland. And like there's centuries of weird, messed up, hyper European stuff going on here. It's really weird.
that's interesting. I mean, that's like, I know that Newfoundland has a very, I don't know if it's very large, but it has like a founding community of Irish people, doesn't it?
Yeah, this is also especially true of the Maritimes in general, although Nova Scotia is, again, New Scotland, so very much goes hard on like the whole Scottish thing. But speaking of Scotland, and to sort of tie it back into imperialism, some of, if not one of the largest Highland games are the Glengarry Highland Games, hosted in Maxville, Ontario. Which you'd think, like, hey, why are some of the biggest Scottish games in the world happening in a rural community in Eastern Ontario? What's going on here? And it's like, well, the Scots were also part of the United Kingdom, like the earliest form of it. So yeah, they got in early on the imperialism floor. Like, that's what it is. But yeah, Newfoundland has very much some of that Irish heritage. So like there are a lot of Catholics there. It's not uncommon to find various different communities that still retain some form of Irish connection and culture. Newfoundland is honestly fascinating. It's the only province I haven't like been to or seen with my own eyes. And I would love to go one day, because it's this fascinating and horrifying mix. The original indigenous inhabitants, the Beothuk, were absolutely slaughtered to the point of extinction. But there are other indigenous groups. The Mi'kmaq have a claim to various corners of Newfoundland, so they're seen as now the tied indigenous people to there. In Labrador, which is the mainland part of the province, because it's officially the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. Labrador is fascinating because it has like Inuit indigenous people in the very north, in the like Torngat Mountains and along the coast. And they also have, like, I think Innu and Naskapi along the various other corners of Labrador coast in the interior. And then you again have the Mi'kmaq on the island itself. And then there's the fact that it was its own self-governing dominion until 1949, when it joined Canada. The provincial police force in Newfoundland is the Royal Newfoundland Constabulary, to bring it back to what you were saying earlier about constabularies. St. John's is a big modern cosmopolitan city, but Newfoundland, instead of like little towns, they call their communities outports, because most of them are in isolated little nooks and crannies and coves all around the coast. Some of their food is unique, and the terms for it feels very, European and Irish. And some of what they like, how they speak, has a very like Irish or, UK kind of feel to it. It's easily the most European accent you can find in Canada. It's not the only one, but it's like the closest. So it is honestly just a fascinating place, which I would love to go and see and spend some time in. But it is the history and the legacy of the Irish here is something that can be found in Newfoundland, but also weirdly enough in Quebec, again because of the Catholic connection. So there were Irish mercenaries and volunteers fighting on the side of the French during the Battle of the Plains of Abraham that would finally cement New France as being under British rule and determining the English to be the hegemons of North America. And again, as there were Irish orphans being adopted throughout the 17 and 1800s, there became a push for them to also keep their family names. It was one of the few things that they had. And so you now have this very weird phenomenon where there are like deeply francophone people, like they almost refuse to speak English, and they have last names like O'Malley and Higgins, and you're like, this is just fascinating. But it's part of that legacy and that Catholic connection, because they felt, well, the English treat me like crap and they hate the Catholics, I'll at least go be with other Catholics, which is also why Quebec has a not insignificant Portuguese population as opposed to other parts of the country, which, like, yes, now it's improved, but for a while it was like, yeah, Montreal has like a great little Portugal, and there were Portuguese fishing communities and like Basque fishermen along the Maritimes and whatnot. So there is like some fascinating history, even though it has to be seen through the lens of the settler colonial state. But it is something that I think a lot of people don't recognize or understand about Canada, and why that also leads to some very weird and nuanced divisions within Canada about certain identities and ethnicities and about religion. It is very weird.
There was a video, if I can find it, you may have seen it actually, because it had quite a lot of views, but it was from a Greek Canadian guy. So he was kind of looking at it semi from the outside, where he was talking about the different racial and ethnic.
I haven't seen this. I need to find this now.
I will dig around in my history and find it, because it was really, really interesting. And he was going over some of that, and basically why Canadian multiculturalism doesn't look the same as the rest of North America. Well, basically between it and the US. I think that was what he was comparing it to. But and I thought it was fascinating, and I've forgotten quite a bit of it now. But he, as I said, he was coming at it from the perspective of being a child of, if not immigrants, then the grandchild of immigrants, basically, and what being Greek, how that fitted in with all of that, and yeah, it was very interesting. It was a very interesting video, and he went over some of what you were describing of the different sort of European dynamics within Canada and the different levels and layers of how they all developed as they were all coming in at different times for different reasons. So yeah, it was interesting, and you find that I think Canada, out of all the sort of the sort of settler nations of the British Empire specifically, might have some of the most complex white ethnic dynamics. Because I think that's the thing, is that the dynamics between it and its indigenous people and its racialized minorities, particularly those of African descent, is very similar across the board. That's one of those constants.
Yes.
So the fiddlier bits come when you start looking at the different religious and ethnic dynamics among the Europeans. That's when it's like, okay, because in Australia, for example, Australia has a very large British contingent, to the point where there's about 1 million British born people currently living in Australia. There's just like this constant flow of British people into Australia, and Australia is a difficult place to get into because of their incredibly violent and incredibly stringent immigration standards, or criteria. That's the word. I couldn't find the word. But it's still easier for Brits to move in than many other people, right? Yeah. It's I like to call it the British diaspora, right? It's massive in Australia, because yes, you've got these British born, but then you've got millions of white Australians who are and actually quite a lot of Indigenous and First Nations Australians actually, who not by choice have British blood in them too. And there, the Irish are also a huge population because of
penal colonies,
where a lot of them were imprisoned, or a lot of them were just sent over there by the British. A lot of them were children sent over there as well. But the kind of it's weird. I don't want to say that it's there isn't as much of a tension between the Catholics and the Protestants in Australia, but it doesn't play out the same as Canada because there wasn't this Irish group or this other kind of Catholic group that were trying to be autonomous in the first place. They were kind of all coming over at the same time. So now Catholicism is very institutionalized in Australia, and there are a lot of very powerful high profile Catholics in Australia, even though technically it was founded by WASPs who would have been discriminating against those Irish Catholics. So it's just it's really interesting how that plays out because those identities would have been forming kind of at the same ish time, but obviously, actually no, Canada's would have been going back a lot further than Australia.
and I think that's part of why the dynamic is the way it is here in Canada. Is we are the oldest of the like British dominions and settler colonial projects that crucially remained loyal to the crown. America obviously left earlier, so that's a different thing. Whereas Canada, it's like, yeah, various corners of the eastern half of this country, when you look at like British involvement and like how the 13 colonies then as a British institution were behaving, then yeah, the history goes back to like the 1600s here. It's pretty wild. And then, of course, it sort of has to split away with the whole American thing. And then it focuses more on then the British imperial legacy and then the United Empire loyalists, the people who fled America to come up here or fled to corners of the of like the Bahamas and Jamaica and whatnot, where they left like the American South for the Caribbean. And there's that extra layer of time and history to add to the weirdness of whiteness here in Canada. And that's not to say that, again, they still didn't hate each other. I mean, there were multiple conflicts in various corners, again, over jobs and whatnot, between the Irish and the French because, oh, well, they're French, whereas we're at least English. I know they're Catholic brothers, but forget those guys. They're silly, whereas we got modern ideas. It's like, guys, really, at the end of the day, the Brits both hate you. Like, come on. But at the time, it was still like, no, we gotta fight them, like especially during like the lumber times, like when it was all about like the lumber baron period in Canada. So much violence going on between like English, Irish, French, Canadian, like a borderline internal war practically was going on in certain areas. It was absolutely wild and kind of horrifying when you like think about that and how it's another thing that we don't talk about in our history of like, hey, remember how we had like gang level warfare between various different ethnic groups over lumber mills and like profit? Should we maybe talk about that? Nah, that's not important. It's absolutely wild.
Wow. No, but yeah, okay, it makes sense. It definitely makes sense. And it's just like lie after lie after lie over time. And it's like, is the average school curriculum going to, or even higher education curriculum, frankly, is it really going to be willing to undo generations of lying about itself?
Well,
No.
it can't, because then that would call into question the like legitimacy and pride in Canada, which is why so many people, be they liberal or conservative, push back against that, because they all came away with a similar understanding of our nation's history. We are the good guy. We're one of the good guys. Come on now. And it's like, that's because we've been on the quote unquote right side of history for a long time by virtue of being tied to the British Empire. And then after that being tied to America.
Yeah.
So like there isn't really a lot of opportunity to kind of do the big foreign war crimes and stuff, that they still happen when we participate in various foreign wars and occupations. But it is definitely this weird thing where I see so many people being proud to be Canadian. And I mean, yeah, look, my life is half decent in Canada. I've been afforded privileges of higher education, of being able to travel, coming with a certain international respect of, oh yeah, the Canadians, they're so nice. And then telling people, yeah, so let me tell you some things. I'm about to ruin my country for you. You know, like, but Canada has incredible propaganda, like you said about the Nordic countries and Scandinavian countries, incredible propaganda at covering up centuries of slavery, abuse, mistreatment, eugenics, like absolutely messed up history going on up here. But it's not talked about, and it's swept under the rug, and most people don't know or care about it. Hell, there were people that were more angry that old Catholic churches, many of which were like deconsecrated, were burnt down in the wake of like more news coming out about the abuses of the Catholic Church, which played a prominent role in the residential school system, which is again a form of genocide. People, there were people who were more mad that churches, some were like active churches, but many were just like old churches sitting on property that had been deconsecrated. No one was using them. Like, oh, this is bad. How come the prime minister won't, condemn these awful attacks against religious people? And it's like, Beverly, sweetie, can we wonder and talk about maybe why the churches are being burned? Maybe what's in the news right now about the horrific treatment of indigenous people within Catholic-run schools maybe has something to do about that. How they refuse to pay what they owe indigenous people while making millions upon millions off of real estate deals by selling indigenous land that they claim and abused indigenous people on. Maybe that's why some of the churches are being burnt, ma'am. But it's just like, oh no, I'm a Catholic and white and I see the church and that rubs me the wrong way, I tell you. Like, oh my God. So yeah, it's a thing here. Unfortunately, people were like also mad of like, well, why are they tearing down statues of the Queen? And I had to be that person at the party or at the barbecue or at the bar or whatever to say, so the Queen is the crown. The crown represents the ongoing fights with the treaties, which means technically it's the Queen who's signing off on continued disenfranchisement of indigenous people, etc., etc. But like people just couldn't make that connection. And they don't get news from indigenous people or often from people like me who are kind of more aware of this stuff and like trying to listen to indigenous people and communities and First Nations and hear their comments and concerns about, the issues that they're trying to bring to light. And so, for them, they just see like tearing down statues. Well, that's vandalism and I don't like that. And they can't unpack like why people would be driven to do that,
Yeah, that I've seen these monuments that they're not. This is the thing that I find in the UK as well, because we've got this up until recently, because it's all blown up in everybody's faces. And I think that Prince Andrew was one of the catalysts of this. But up until about 5 minutes ago, the British had this view of the monarchy just being a figurehead, right? And we have all of these statues. It's not just the monarchy, it's also the aristocracy, and it's also various names that you hear about in history, or there's a statue and you don't even pay attention to who it belongs to, right? It's just a person. And so we've got these we've got just off the top of my head, there's the Jeffrey Museum, which is in East London. Jeffrey being a massive colonizing enslaver, just imperialist piece of shit, really and truly, right? And so there were protests against that museum, and Hackney Council said, oh yeah, we're going to shut it down, and it's still there, right? But one of the more high profile examples of people sort of suddenly noticing, I say suddenly, the local community are always aware, yeah. And then the rest of the country becomes aware. So there had been a statue in Bristol, which is a city in southwest England, with a very long history of port active. Basically, every port area in the UK is implicated in some kind of imperial fuckery, right? Yep. So Bristol has its own. And there was this statue of a man named Edward Colston, who was a massive, massive, massive slave owner. And the Bristolians had been bothered about this for years. Like, they had been talking about this to their local politicians for years, saying, you need to get this statue down. We don't want it here. Fell on deaf ears. So eventually, during 2020, in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder and the Black Lives Matter protests that were flourishing everywhere. So there was a Black Lives Matter protest in Bristol, and these young people literally tore it down, and it became one of these.
I remember that, yeah.
Yeah, it got beamed around the world, and it got dashed into the river. They then recovered it, and now it's in a museum somewhere, right? And what was funny about that was the rhetoric, because you suddenly had, I like to call British people sleeper cells. I don't necessarily think that they are completely ignorant. But what I found fascinating and terrifying about that moment, I was in my house, right? Everyone was in lockdown.
Yeah.
And was 1 minute all of these innocuous statues that even a lot of us, like me, I didn't know that that statue was there. I've not been to Bristol yet, so I didn't know about that, right? And there are all these different things that you just walk past every day, and either the local community is aware of it and has been campaigning about it, or literally it's so long forgotten that people you don't clock, and then you're like, oh God, I was walking past that. You know, there are parks named after slave owners that local, roads and schools, etc., that have had to have their names changed because of who they were connected to. But what I found fascinating is that your average Brit, if you ask them how they feel about the monarchy, or if you ask them how they feel about various sort of emblems of culture, they basically play like they don't notice, and where there's this default kind of indifference leaning towards the positive. But it's very much like, they're figureheads, I don't think about it, whatever. But then the second these things start to be challenged or actively removed, they mobilize, they activate. Suddenly they are outraged, like that lady that the proverbial woman who was offended at the churches being burned down. She probably walked past those churches every day of her life, not giving them a second thought if they were deconsecrated. They
I
might
mean,
not.
probably not even because they're on like indigenous communities, like far away from society because they kept them that way, out of sight, out of mind, and away from more difficult for their indigenous families to try and get to them and spend time with them. Like,
And now it's out of the way. It's out of people. It's never been in the public consciousness to the point of it then being put out of the way. It's just this constant in the background, in the periphery. And then the second it's challenged, now everybody has an opinion to protect and to be offended by the desecration of these things. And it's like, wait, you just said that, if I had asked you about this 2 years ago, you wouldn't have had a clue about it. So why do you now suddenly have an opinion?
yeah.
And now you're being informed, you're being educated in the process. You went from having no idea about this at all to only finding out about it because people are burning it down or because people are pulling it down. But your response is to be offended. So I like to call the British sleeper cells in the sense that they do have an opinion, they do have a stance, they just don't have to enact it. And now that you've got all of these things happening, as I said, the fallout from Prince Andrew onwards, and the way that for the first time in my lifetime personally, we're having conversations, and people much older than me, there are these high profile conversations about the usefulness of the monarchy. And your average Brit, if you had polled them on the street, they would have just been like, they bring in tourism. Whereas now you've got some people who seem very, very passionately pro monarchy, and their knowledge and education about the monarchy is still basically in the same place that it was before, because we don't learn much about them as an entity actually in this country, funnily enough, as central as they are. I just find it fascinating. I really do. It's just the way everyone sort of does complicitly buy into something, even if they don't admit it, or even if they're not fully aware of it until it's time to mobilize around the protection of these symbols of empire and these symbols of oppression. And the fact of the matter is, this is why I disagree with the notion that ordinary people they are subject to it, but they are also tools of it. So that's why I always kind of want to talk about some of the things that ordinary people were doing to the imperial effort, rather than just only talking about the elites, because in the UK, those are the only people you hear about. You don't hear about the masses of people who signed up quite happily for some of this because they could see their place in the hierarchy, and
that's a very good point. Yeah.
Oh God, yeah, like because it's a big problem here. There is an element of when they are made to face up to it, there is then that, oh well, my ancestors were peasants, so what were we doing? And it's like the empire was an effort. It wasn't simply, and yeah, okay, there were pockets here and pockets there of ignorance. I'm not going to say that, but that's why in one of my videos, where I was talking about class solidarity and people of color solidarity, and I had to talk about what the white working class in this country were doing at the time of the establishment of the mines in South Africa and Australia, because they were, in some instances, keeping up more with that news out in the empire, and this is obviously pre-internet, than their own local news, because that was what they were invested in. Those were their men, those were their brothers, those were where they were intending on going at some point, and they were just waiting to hear word. And those people would have been the sort of great granddad times a couple of numbers of the people living today saying, "Oh, my ancestors didn't do anything in the empire," and it's like, yes, the fuck they did, and half the time they knew what they were doing. It wasn't just being funneled into a system. It was an element of buy-in into that system because obviously, yeah, you might not know about it if you're not exposed to it, but once you are, you know what's going on out there, and you didn't react. So you were part of the underclass or part of the lower class in the UK. The UK has a very, very, very established class system. So yeah, you were hated and there was no mobility for you. But as soon as you went out into one of the settler nations, you were able to enjoy a massive amount of upward mobility. Some of those miners were incredibly rich on the back of what they were doing out there, or at least comfortable, you know?
Well, yeah, again, to sort of bring it back to like the sort of compare and contrast of Britain and Canada, talking about, settlers and agreeing with the project. France had a very difficult time trying to get people to go to Quebec because the landscape and terrain is difficult, and there's a lot of hostile native populations, and it's very cold, colder than continental or like metropolitan France. So, yeah, I get that, that there were some struggles for that, and not everyone was exactly an eager participant. But at the same time, the situation in these home countries of, the United Kingdom, of France, of, Sweden, and all these other areas that tried to do a colonialism was, hey, are you poor? We're not going to help you here, but try your chance in the New World. And so a lot of desperate people were like, all right, sure, why not? I don't know anything about farming, but yeah, I'll at least have land. I'll own my own land. And then they go to wherever, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, America, go on the frontier, fight with indigenous people who are understandably pissed off. And but it's a desperation play. And so part of me understands that, but there are also plenty of other people, like hell, there were the posters from Canada in, again, the late 1800s and early 1900s, calling our prairies, ripe for settlement. They didn't want the Americans to get in there. We called it the last best West, and promoted it in Eastern Canada and over in Europe of yeah, come to Canada, the last best West. Are you a farmer here and struggling? Well, you can get 100 acres out in the beautiful new pristine prairies of Canada. Just go. And there's sod houses out there now that you have to build because there's no wood and all this other stuff, right? It became, and the railway towns that would spring up along the way and whatnot, all this stuff. But what often goes unremarked upon is that, again, because Canada didn't have, Canada had slavery, and in a lower number than the States, because we didn't have plantation slavery the way you could have in the Deep South and in the Caribbean for sugar and cash crops, right? But slavery was still useful for one purpose, which fundamentally changed the way the country looks: land clearing. A lot of slaves in Canada were used for clearing land. So it wasn't really the idea of hard scrabble ma and pa from England, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, or from somewhere in France to come to La Nouvelle France in Quebec to hard scrabble by. Yes, there were many people who still did clear their own land and had big families and support, but there were a lot of cases where, hey, don't worry about it, gents, we got the 500 slaves of the collective seigneurs from this area to clear and till the fields for us. So just, I don't know, build some mills, build your homes, and supervise them and plant the crops and whatnot. And when you start to realize that, that makes it even more horrifying. We see all this pristine farmland and we think, my ancestors did that. And it's so yes, but also no, they did not. It's the result of a lot of slave labor, clearing land, and oh, look at these big old beautiful trees. We'll ship them out. Lumber mills. A lot of the earliest lumber mill barons were built on the backs of slave labor, even though by the time it became the most prominent, which is mid 1800s, slavery had now been gone for a decade or so in the colonies here. But that doesn't mean that practice was brand new. It was it had clearly been developed, and these people had first become some of the wealthiest barons through slavery in this country you know? And like people don't realize how it's tied into all these different areas, and it's sickening when you really start tearing it apart and like getting into the nitty gritty of how insidious it was everywhere, and how it's just, oh no, it's a historic footnote. We abolished slavery decades before the Americans in 1831. Good job, us. And it's like, so what about the period before that? Like,
Exactly. Oh my God. Like, one of the key reasons my channel exists is because I'm tired of that whole America. We're better than America. We're not like
that's such
America.
a low bar.
It really is. And also, America exists like the way it does because of places like, particularly the UK, but then also the French, the
Yes.
Dutch, the Spanish. But God, like, let's be flipping serious. There's a reason why the state speaks English. So,
Right.
let's be serious now, guys. And but it pisses me off. So it's like one of the real core spiteful reasons why my channel exists is just because I'm tired and I want every country to do the same. It's like expose your country's BS so that they can stop hiding behind the states, because we know the states is bad. There are things about the states that I don't think people fully understand. Like, it is an active imperialist state. Like, I want people to describe it more for what it is, which is an empire, not just simply this very powerful country. Like, it's, or influential countries. Like, how did it get that influence? Why is there so much American shit around the world? It's because their armies are bloody everywhere. Like, so, and they have been for decades. This is not a good thing. This is not positive. I no longer think of things, when I hear about things that Americans have introduced somewhere, it's nearly always through a military presence. And it's just such an easy story. Oh, well, they got fried chicken there because of the Americans. Oh, they play rock music there because of the Americans. So that's imperialism, in the same way that there's a reason why so many places speak English or French or what have you, right? But at the same time, as much as I don't think people fully appreciate America's imperialism, they just understand its power. I'm tired of people hiding behind it because it's just too bloody easy. And also, even the way we describe its dynamics with other countries. So you get places described as vassal states, which is true, but I think it almost I don't commit to that rhetoric, not because it's not true, but more because I think it obfuscates understanding of what's really going on. So it's like with the British, for example, yeah, okay, they could see the writing on the wall round about the Second World War. They were on their knees, they were struggling. All of these old imperialist states were struggling to keep a hold of their empires. So yes, there was an element of consensual exchange where it was like, okay, states, you guys are great. You've been great during the World War. You've been great leading up to this. You've been ramping up your industrialism. You're really there. You're really powerful. We've got the Soviet, as it evolved past the Second World War period, you had the Cold War and all of those dynamics, right? But the UK didn't lose all of its power in the process. And that's the thing, the way that it's almost like there was a complete and total transfer of power from all of these old countries to the new, aka the States, is inaccurate. And I think it completely absolves places like here, like France, like wherever. And then in the case of places like Canada and Australia, where they have this kind of origin story on the back of imperialism. And so it's like, we exist by accident, guys. Like, we didn't make this happen, but now we're here, don't shout at us. And also we were also subjects of another imperialist. And it's like, yeah, but you're neo-imperialists now. And again, yeah, America does a lot of things through you, but you're not entirely at the mercy of them. Like, I just think that the way people describe American geopolitics works to absolve. And I don't know if there's better language to use, because we do need to be clear and specific, because you don't want to have the opposite happen of where you end up absolving the states. And I don't know if that would happen. But there's just something that annoys me a little bit in how we describe that transition of power and how we describe how it looks now. It just kind of makes everybody else seem very passive, when a lot of these places have maintained old relationships. France still is literally actively colonizing West Africa, for example.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, okay, technically the French Empire doesn't exist anymore, but let's be serious. Like,
it exists with extra steps. Like,
literally, and it's in fact even harder to point to now, because those countries, are they going to have a war of independence again? No, like, because there's nothing technically to be independent from. So it's just kind of even weirder to define and pin down. So the way Canada hide behind the states the way the UK hides behind the place, the way the rest of Europe hides behind the Anglophone countries, because the rest of Europe has two groups of people that it hides behind, which is the British and the Americans. And it's like, you had better not do that in front of me, because just because you speak Dutch or just because you speak French or whatever doesn't mean you're you're not a white supremacist imperialist state. Stop it.
Yeah.
You know?
It's like the world is the way it is because of all of y'all and your horrors. Like, let's be real here.
In whatever language, like don't piss me off. Like, but it happens a lot. And from what we've been talking about today, it happens a lot with Canada as well. And it's just too convenient because it's literally its northern neighbor. Yeah. So it's like physically, it can almost physically hide behind the States. So it's like, no, not us.
Hi, Bother Brigade. Thank you once again for tuning into another episode of Progressive Profiles. If you actually truly made it here to the end of the video, I am well and truly impressed. This was a very long one. And guess what? Coming up on Patreon soon, you're going to see basically another like 2 hours of content that was cut from this. It was incredibly productive. I hope you learned a lot here. You're going to learn even more over on Patreon. So, maybe go check that out if you're really interested. Also, thanks again to our guest Jay for being here. And please go check out her content. It is fantastic. But also, while still on the subject of Patreon, I want to thank out some very particular patrons who have been supporting me for a long time and at the highest possible level. So a huge shout out to Jean-Luc Desroches, Patrick Mansuri, Botherer69, and Jennifer Randall. Y'all are the goats. But I also want to again thank everyone who tuned into this. Again, especially if you made it here this far to the end. And I really hope you learned and appreciated a lot and about the shared interconnected struggle and weirdness that is British imperialism and its various little minion dominions. And the fact that this is a part of history that is not known by too many people, including in our own countries, is definitely what's bothering me today.